So this session is going to be for 60 minutes. I think our moderators and all our panelists can also see the timer right there with the big 60 on it. Once again, I request and I hope that the people who want to ask questions in these sessions have downloaded the Kantipur Conclave app on their mobile phones. If you haven't, you can connect to NCEL and the password is Kantipur. So this session is Youth for Nepal. This is a key session, and the moderator for this session is the opinions editor of the Kathmandu Post, Leena Dahal. She has been with the Kathmandu Post for 4 months, relatively very, very young and very, very new. And of late, if you might have been reading some very interesting op-ed on the discourse of identity and some really fresh perspective on the pertinent issues of identity, I would like to say that I'm pretty sure it will be from her. Her research interests revolve around unpacking the role of social media in shaping and disrupting democratic agency and civic engagement. I think Leena represents a fresh new breed of young Nepalese who are coming to Nepal not because they don't have an option, but because it is their choice and they believe in the potential of Nepal and everything that Nepal has to offer. I definitely look forward to this session, and I'm sure many young Nepalese all across Nepal and abroad who are watching us live through the YouTube channel of Kantipur Conclave are as excited as I am. So without any further ado, I would now like to request Ms. Leena Dahal to kindly carry forward with the session.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, distinguished guests. Thank you, speakers, and of course, this incredible panel. I think just based on the number of times we've heard youth emerge as a topic of conversation in the past addresses, indicates how important youth are in this larger movement of unleashing Nepal's potential. But I also think we can be in agreement that 40 minutes is nowhere enough time to tackle all the issues facing youth with the depth and detail they deserve. So I'm going to preface this conversation by saying our primary exercise here is one of reflection. We're going to be asking this incredible all-star panel to reflect on their personal experiences, their observations, and unpack some of these challenges and opportunities for youth in Nepal's development. So I'm going to formally introduce them, but we're going to transition later to a more organic introduction. So I've asked all of them to prepare a brief few points of reflection, and then we'll move into a more organic conversation. So Sumnima Udas, you might have been following her in her incredible journey through CNN, but she's back in Nepal as the founder and director of Museum of Buddhism and Sacred Spaces. So Sumnima, if you could start off and just tell us more about your work.
Thanks, Leena, and namaste to everyone here. Having never really lived here before and coming back after a long time, I left Nepal when I was 6 months old, I often come across as one of those wide-eyed cheerleaders, super optimistic cheerleaders for Nepal. But when you talk about this topic in particular, I am super optimistic and hopeful because I feel like beyond all of the challenges that people face here, beyond the fact that this country really hasn't been able to provide the kind of opportunities the youth seeks, we have still progressed. And by progress, I don't necessarily mean just in terms of GDP or material wealth, but in terms of how inclusive we've become, how open of a society we've become, and how compassionate. And I encountered this firsthand when I came here to cover the earthquake for CNN, and just seeing how the youth really came together in the most imaginative ways to help out. That was truly inspiring, and having covered many disasters in other places, that is not a usual reaction. So having said that, we have a lot of work to do, and I think it's a situation here similar to many other countries that are going through the underdeveloping to the developed stage, where there are so many opportunities, but they're not very perceptible. You kind of have to dig deeper and scratch under the surface, and you find them. So I came up with this crazy idea to create a museum for Buddhism in Lumbini. I moved here 2 years ago, and I mean, to be honest, where else could I have showed up and said, I want to build a museum, and for that to work out? So the opportunities are there. You just have to find them.
Thank you. Sixit, if we could. Sixit is the CEO of Tootle, but he's also a really strong entrepreneurial ideologist, I would say. Like, conversations with him have always been compelling, so he has many different hats on.
Namaste, sabaijanalai. My name is Sixit, and unlike Sumnima, I've lived my entire life in Nepal. I was born in far western Doti, and it's for the quest of good education. My parents brought me to Kathmandu, and my entire life I've spent working for various organizations, including a telecom company for 7 years. After that, I spent 5 years working for a bank. And then I jumped into entrepreneurship. And I've always maintained that I never became an entrepreneur to solve a problem. Because at that age, entrepreneurship, when we went to school, was just a chapter that we had to pass. I became an entrepreneur to express myself. And therefore, I value human expression. And I feel entrepreneurship is like any form of art, music, dance, poetry, painting, whatever you'd like to say. So it's a form of my expression and a way by which not only we enable people in finding solutions to the challenges, but also how we can shape up our society and country in a longer term. So that's the belief with which we started Tootle, with a brand motto of enabling everyone with the freedom of mobility and the freedom of movement. Because in the country like ours, because of the lack of mobility infrastructure, people lack that freedom of movement. And enabling everyone with the inclusive technology to move around also enables them with economic opportunity. And we've successfully been able to do that by having an inclusive technology like the technology that enables even the visually impaired people to use our services, women to select women bikers only. And with that, we've been really, really happy to provide that mobility. But in doing so, we've also been very happy to have provided more than 10,000 jobs in a very short time. And allowing people to make income by living in their own country and having people back to work here. So that's been our quest, and that's been our vision for the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Next we have Shrinkhala and Miss Nepal World 2018 and the winner of this year's Beauty with a Purpose Award, which we'll hear plenty about during this conversation, I'm sure. So Shrinkhala.
Namaste everyone, I'm Shrinkhala Khatiwada, Miss Nepal World 2018. I don't know how to introduce myself, but right now I'm wearing different hats at different times. Professionally, I'm an architect, but in the past year, I've put on the hat of a social influencer, of a public figure, of running my own non-profit organization, and lots of different things. But I believe that I relate very closely to the youth of Nepal today. Coming from a small town of Khatiwada, I was a very average student, and I came to Kathmandu seeking for bigger opportunities. And I figured out that the competition was so much bigger in the capital. And I acclimatized, I tried to push my limits, and slowly but surely I got used to the challenges of the capital. Somehow I passed through all the challenges in Nepal. I was very lucky, and I'm still very grateful to have won the title of Miss Nepal World 2018, and I got a very tremendous opportunity to represent Nepal at a world stage. What I realized throughout the journey was that Nepali youth, we are not less than anyone. We have the potential to fight against all the big forces around the world. I realized that we Nepalese need this very big boost of positive energy. I can see all around in the boards that if you can dream it, you can do it. And that's been my motto throughout my life. And that's what I plan to do, being a public figure, being a social media influencer, being someone that a lot of youth look up to. That's my plan, to be that positive personality that can actually inspire people to do more and to believe that Nepal has a future, and this is the future we are living in. Thank you.
Thank you, Shrinkhala. Now we have Lex. He's the founder of Tracing Nepal. He also has many different hats on. He has a prolific following on social media, and he's been blogging for over a decade, since he started blogging in 2008. So if you could tell us more about some of these hats, Lex.
Thank you so much, Leena. I feel like you kind of did my job, but to really take it back, even though I was born in Nepal, at the age of 2 I left, and questions like, who are you? Where are you from? They used to bug me a lot of the times. When I was living in Brunei and the UK, I always felt like the other. I had a very romantic idea of Nepal. It was all about, one day I'm going to go back, I'm going to do something. In 2008, when I started my blog from the UK, it was my outlet to express my interest in Nepali cinema, Nepali arts and culture. From then onwards, it has changed, because every time I've come back to Nepal and met incredible Nepali people and friends of Nepal doing amazing action here, I've felt and I've seen that there's so much potential here. And it's when I feel the most alive as well. And along the way, in 2014, we founded Tracing Nepal. Tracing Nepal is a responsible travel program where we get Nepali young people who are living outside of Nepal and bring them to experience the country that maybe their parents left behind at a young age, and to experience Nepal like never before. Okay? So along the way, I've seen that, you know what, sometimes I feel that culturally we are told to dream only the possible, but from 2008 to 2019, I've also realized that, you know what, I have huge potential, and I see that in a lot of other young people in Nepal.
100%. I'm really excited to be dissecting some of these issues that you brought up. But I think a great place to start is by addressing a challenge that governments around the world are facing. You know, with these modern demographic changes and this ever-growing youth bulge, unemployment has become a pressing issue for youth across the world. So I think it's pretty fitting to start there. So Sixit, since you're in the business of job creation, we heard a little bit about the Prime Minister's employment program. If you could talk a little bit about that, do you see the Prime Minister employment program as an effective long-term solution to address the unemployment gap and discourage out-migration among youth? And what role do you see youth entrepreneurs playing in creating a supporting environment for kind of this job creation environment?
You know, if you look at the world, unfortunately, there's a kind of a paradox. The youngest countries are also the poorest countries. The countries that have the maximum sunshine hour are also the poorest countries. I think this is a huge paradox somewhere. You know, when we talk about the employment program of creating jobs, I'm sure it's a short-term solution to a big problem that we have. But there are so many forces that are going to play in next 5 years or 10 years. See, if you look at the entire narrative of the development that we've seen around the world, you'd find somewhere that the numbers of guitars sold is actually corresponding to the economic progress of the country. You know, so the end goal of economic progress is the freedom of expression. And we've also seen that during the Renaissance in Europe. You know, when the Europe developed in the pre-industrial era, it was not just the development of the structures and all. It was also arts and the artisans that progressed. It was Leonardo da Vinci who was doing Mona Lisa. It was Michelangelo who was painting, right? So one narrative is that the end goal of economic progress is the freedom of expression. The second is that, you know, what are the changes that are going to happen in the next 5 years? For example, we could see something happening immediately is the role that artificial intelligence is going to play, you know. There are different literatures that have been written that for the very first time in the human history, we don't only run a risk of physical skills being replaced by machines, but also the cognitive skills being replaced by machines. So what does that mean? And how we architecture our development. Of course, on a short term, we need to create jobs, but also need to have a longer term outlook into what our development model is, right? You know, what's happened is that we have had this demography of youngsters, and we want this young demography to contribute on the development of this country, which is perfectly fine. But I also have an alternative narrative that, don't you think that the development models of economies like ours also should provide an enabling environment to allow the freedom of expression to the youngsters. Of course, we need roads, but we also need theaters. We need bridges, but we also need museums. We need to build airports, but we also need to have a person playing guitar somewhere in the street. You know? We need to have development of structures and infrastructures, but we also need to have people like Lex, a platform where these people can blog and express themselves. And if you look at the signal that I'm seeing in this country, we are having this signal. You know, we have youngsters who are doing stand-up comedy. We have youngsters who are doing the vlogging and the blogging, who are influencing people at the same time. You know? And I see these to be as very strong signals of our society, of the progress that we can have in our country. And I think if we can play it right, if we can have the right narratives of development of our country, I don't see a reason why Nepal, in its own right, can also engage in its own age of renaissance, because we've seen that as in our history that we have done that. We've seen the Patandarwai squares, we've seen the Bhaktapur, and we've seen the rich heritage where we had artisans, people express themselves in the past, and how we can culminate everything together to build this alternative narrative of development is very important. And I think the youngsters, if we have the enabling environment, can play a very, very important role to that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think your point about creating this enabling environment for creative expression is important, especially with regards to Lex's work. You've used creative outlets to tackle really difficult topics and kind of confront long-held traditions and norms in Nepal, especially with regards to LGBT stigma. If you could talk a little bit about why you think creative expression is a useful and important outlet in having these kind of difficult conversations.
For me, I view creative expression, like how it adds value is it acts as a catalyst, okay? And for certain segments of the population, I believe that being creative is how they express themselves the best way, all right? And some difficult conversations can be had much more effectively with visual representation, or whether that's through music, arts, and the project that I did recently with the photo shoot showing love between just two men. And because for some of us living in this society, living in a heteronormative society, we grow up and we see things differently. Okay, and I think that creative expression is one way where we feel comfortable to share our story and to kind of represent ourselves. So I definitely feel that, as Sixit was saying, that is something that should be prioritized, as well as been given more prominence as well. And the other thing is, in addition to using media, this has to go back into the classrooms. This has to go back into the classrooms where, you know, there's a generation where maybe this, the educating part is getting a bit delayed, but we can start with young people. We can start with young people with the hope that maybe they can take these stories and exchange back into the homes and educate and inform their parents too.
I think that's a great point. And just returning back to LGBT inclusivity, what do you think youth can do to, because we've taken important legislative steps since 2015, what can youth do to make sure that this terminology of inclusivity that we're kind of starting to see in legislation is being translated to this cultural social fabric, to the everyday?
Events like this, good collaboration, okay? So there are people who, you know, we have a bit of influence, and it's important that people, figures like us, and not just individuals who are LGBTQIA, but strong allies, they come forth, and we are able to form a synergy, not just with people who are working actively in the front lines, whether that's in Kathmandu or along the Rai. Okay, and forming that partnership and going forward, that is what's really important. The other thing that me and Sixit were discussing yesterday was talking about how when I had my coming out moment, there was this huge acceptance. That's great, but what we now need to move on to is, this is his idea, by the way, he talked about now we need to embrace it. You know, you've accepted me, great, but would you embrace your own son or daughter if they brought home that story? Okay, so that's what we need to do as well.
Thank you. And on that point about embracing difficult changing norms in our society, we're also having youth who are preserving heritage, who are actively preserving culture that has been overlooked and needs preservation. So Sumnima, if we could ask, What role do you think youth play in cultural preservation, and why is it important to engage youth in this endeavor?
Yeah, the thing about culture, art, and heritage is that the true value of those things are quite abstract, quite intangible. So in developing countries, it doesn't carry the same weight all the time as larger issues like poverty or education or health. But at the same time, the problem with the thing about art and culture heritage is that once it's gone, and you can't really go back to the past. So eventually every city starts looking the same. So whether it's Kuala Lumpur or Singapore or Dubai, or closer to home, whether it's Nepalganj or Bhairava or some second or third tier city in northern India, this all starts looking the same, and we eventually start losing our identity. And so it's very important to engage young people at an early age. And when people ask why I'm trying to set up a museum here in Lumbini, I say, well, it's not enough to just say hashtag Buddha was born in Nepal. What do we really know? Have we bothered to really understand what that means? Living in places like New York or Hong Kong, everyone's talking about Buddhist concepts, whether it's meditation, whether it's mindfulness. You watch Star Wars or The Matrix, it's all concepts from Buddhism. Everyone's talking about these things, and this is the birthplace. So we could be doing a lot more. I think we've squandered away one of our biggest national treasures, and it's time to do something about that. And museums aren't built for now, they're built for the next 20, 30, 40 years, and they can have a huge influence on the youth and consequently the country in general.
Thank you. And just to engage you, Shrinkhala, in this topic as well, because when you talk about your approach to architecture, you mentioned that you really want to pay homage to traditional designs, but also integrate innovation like eco-sustainability, address the challenges of our time. So if you could add some more about your work and what youth might be bringing to the architectural field.
The big challenge that the youth, not just Nepali youth, but youth from all around the world, is this big identity crisis because of the globalization that's been happening so rapidly. And what I often see is that we Nepali as a youth, we tend to overlook the fact that Nepal is known for its cultural identity, for its art, its architecture, for its centuries-long history of all the beautiful things that needs to be preserved. But we are squandering away towards a very different direction. We love modern buildings, we love modern technology, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the big question is, where does Nepal stand there? Do we want to compete against Dubai in terms of architecture, or do we want to create our own identity? Because if we compete against Dubai, we are nowhere close to Dubai, we are nowhere close to Malaysia or Singapore. But where we can stand out is when we embrace our architecture, when we embrace our culture, our heritage, and our technology all together and create this whole new identity, new definition of modernity and technology and sustainability. And there's a lot that we can learn from the past because the Malla era was the golden era, and we are still cashing on the Darbar squares that we have that were built centuries ago. And what do we have to offer that's new on the table and that could attract more tourists, that could create a sense of identity in the youth of our country, be it through language, because we can often see Nepali is not viewed as a very good mean of communication right now. Even the smallest of things like that can make a big difference, and it all adds on to our culture, our tradition, and architecture can bind it all together.
Thank you. I think as we are talking about innovation, and whether in the fields of architecture, whether in preservation or challenging culture, I think the government plays a large role in shaping the playground for this innovation by coming up with the legislation for it, by supporting this spirit. So on that note, the government has expressed its commitment for supporting youth innovation in its Youth Vision 2025. We've heard it in the addresses today as well. But what does that look like in action? And so Sumnima, because you were involved with the government, your project required government approval. What did these conversations look like? Did they differ from what you thought they'd look like? Just give us more insight in what that looked like.
Well, it took me 2 years to get the permissions, and I have yet to figure out if that is quick by Nepal's standards or slow. But, you know, I did the rounds. I went to all the different departments and officials, but I was surprised to see how receptive everyone was. And of course, no one says no. Everyone says, "Hunsa bhayalsani." But it took that long. The main challenge was really the cynicism, I think. A lot of people think you've come here with a certain agenda, so trying to convince them the honesty behind your pursuit and your genuine intentions was always difficult. The other problem was also trying to explain or communicate the possibilities that are out there, because when you think museum, you normally think what's out next door to you or what you're used to seeing here. To really explain the possibilities and try to, and I constantly found myself saying, you know, I know it sounds ambitious, I know it looks like this can't be done, but if there's anywhere in Nepal where we can do something world-class, it is Lumbini. So that's how I sort of pitched it, and I was fortunate enough that, of course, the government changed while I was going through this process, and I thought I would have to start from scratch again, but luckily we had the current minister who, you know, I met him, and I'd never met him before, and then literally in 2 minutes, he's like, love the idea, let's go to Lumbini the next day. So I lucked out, but there are people like that who are willing to take that risk. And you know, the organization I work with, which is the Lumbini Development Trust, lots of good people there, but they would not have been able to take such a big risk and sort of trust this private entity to come in. So yeah, it takes one person sometimes, and you know, and it worked out eventually.
Yeah, I think you're kind of highlighting these moments of compromise when the government sees innovation potential in youth, and then makes me kind of think about what happened with the ride-sharing apps. When the government lifted the ban on ride-sharing apps, many people were quick to point at this moment of compromise as an example of what can happen in New Nepal. So as someone with like a direct stake in this moment of compromise, how did you view it, Sixit?
Yeah, I think what happened at that time was, you know, mobility is such a big human need, right? And we had filled in a gap that was not filled in with an existing infrastructure. Not only about creating point-to-point mobility, but also inclusive mobility and creating jobs. And that's the kind of the force and the expression that our youth have. And it was primarily because of that we had a statement from the government on which we were allowed to function smoothly. But you know, I still think that the statement that came from the government needs to have a deeper narrative, not to see us as business people, but as entrepreneurs who are working to shape up the behavior of people. You know, there are two ways of looking at it. One is that you, as a government, you enable structures on which entrepreneurship and human behavior thrive. The other could be, it's a famous word coined by Richard Thaler. It's called libertarian paternalism. You know, whether we create structures on which behavior thrive, or we create new behaviors by which we can shape up newer structures. And I'll give you an example. There's an article written by the co-founder of Lyft. When we share rides, you know, if you look at the development of the global world after industrialization, I think our global development was based on vehicles. You know, more vehicles, bigger roads, wider roads, bigger space for vehicles to be parked. It was never developed around people and communities. So the broader narrative of mobility and ride sharing is about inculcating that behavior by which our communities can shape up in future, in next 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, right? Now, can you imagine that the 90% of the vehicles that are in the city are actually parked? The parking space right there at Hayat could be a football ground for our kids to play, isn't it? And look at the number of spaces that we've created for lifeless vehicles just to chat amongst themselves if they had lives, right? Now, if we share infrastructure, we could do with 10% of the vehicles. Now, what that would do? What that would do is what we've done with Patan Darbar Square. Patan was never built around vehicles. It was built around people. And therefore, you have big chokes where community can gather, where you can have parties, where you can have people interact. As we reduce the number of vehicles, our city would transform. We'd have more interactions. We'd have more walking spaces. We'd have more spaces for kids to play. You know, every parking spot that we have at our house is a space for our kids to play, isn't it? So I think the government should have a long-term narrative of what entrepreneurship can do to shape up human behavior in a long term. So if Metro Tarkari, for example, is delivering Tarkari online, they're not only an e-commerce site who are delivering Tarkari online, because by 2050, there's going to be a 50% global deficit of demand and supply of food. And 1/3 of the food that's actually produced goes to waste. Now, if we can have this supply chain enabled, they're not only solving a convenience problem for people, they're actually solving a food security problem. You know, so how can we deal with the broader narrative of the global challenges, whether it's mobility, whether it's infrastructure, or whether it's food security? And I think it's about time that the leadership and the government needs to take active roles as to what the entrepreneurship can do by shaping up behaviors through which infrastructures can be shaped. And at the same time, how you enable that infrastructure to automatically and organically come in place. So I think that is a bigger narrative and a bigger discussion that is required, rather than a very small, rather than a step that happens through an event like ours.
I think on that point about continuing that conversation, the government is not the only entity involved in it's very much a two-way street with the entrepreneurs as well. And on that note, I think it would be fair to say that youth entrepreneurs like yourself who are bringing these very new ideas, challenging, bringing innovation to old age solutions like transportation mobility, they're held to a higher standard. And so just reflecting on Tootle's decision-making history, especially with regards to initial decisions, especially concerning tax laws, what happened there? What have you learned, and what can other youth entrepreneurs learn from this experience?
I knew that was coming. So, the first thing is that as an entrepreneur, you cannot only be glorified for the things that you did well. And as an entrepreneur, I'll tell you that, we should also be able to take that blow. And it was a mistake on our side. And I can take this forum to apologize to people who have had high hopes and respect towards the brand that we created. But at the same time, we should also appreciate the fact that I was telling some people that when the plane is in an emergency, if any flyers around, they're taught 3 rules: aviate, navigate, and communicate. The first job of a pilot is to keep the plane on air, and then you navigate, and then you communicate. Unfortunately, we've been so focused on aviating the plane, trying to get the business model right, trying to focus on creating solutions, enabling people to move around, that other things around compliance actually took up a back seat. But it was a compliance issue, which we are already working with the government to solve it, and I hope that people would see from that benefit of the doubt. And I think it's like त्यो एउटा हाम्रो उसमा समुद्र मन्थन भन्ने छ नि. I think we are at an age where we are doing that समुद्र मन्थन, and अमृत खान पाइन्छ भनेपछि कहिलेकाहीँ कालकुट विष पनि लिएर हिँड्नुपर्छ. And I think our people are resilient, and I hope they would give us the benefit of the doubt in that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think the fact that you're so vocal about this has made for really important lessons and conversations for youth entrepreneurs, so thank you. So just like based on what has been said, just opening up this question to the floor, do you think this new Nepal has offered any particular opportunities to youth, whether they're in entrepreneurship, whether they're in development? What tangible opportunities has new Nepal offered?
I just want to add on to the previous question that you asked, Sixit. I don't necessarily see anything concrete that New Nepal has offered, other than the fact that we recently had an a new employment policy, if I'm not wrong, yeah. So we had that, and then we have a bunch of new things here and there coming up, but not a lot of people are aware about it, and it hasn't really made a direct impact on my life in any ways. But then Tootle was there, which actually made a direct impact on my life, and then I see the news that okay, Tootle is banned, and I can't use Tootle anymore. So what that made me think was that information technology is moving at such a fast pace. I mean, no one in the world can actually predict what the technology might have to offer tomorrow, but we can actually be a little bit foresighted. Instead of having policies that are 30-year-old, 35-year-old, trying to deal with the technology of today, it's so funny to even contemplate the fact that Tootle is having to rely on the policies that were 30 years old. So what I would like to request the government of today is, I'm very, very grateful that the government is trying to push this information technology idea of having a new modern Nepal based on technology. But when you do something like banning Tootle out of the blue, when all the taxis have been taking fares so much higher than usual, and everybody knows that meters, they don't run in taxi. And you know, there's this such a big bureaucratic system that's been running our country, and then Tootle comes up, that is a sole lone entity, and everyone is targeting Tootle. So what we need to do is, we need to promote youth who are coming up with innovative ideas as such. We need to actually create events that are inviting new ideas, and we need to ask the youth, okay, so what are the new ideas that we have, and how can we as policymakers help in drafting the new policies that are more inviting to the more new ideas that might come up, instead of slashing all the new things as business propaganda. They are trying to stop the taxis from running and this and that. Why aren't we trying to force the youth to actually brainstorm and bring more ideas on the table, instead of sending them abroad where they are not even using their brains? All of the youth that go abroad, I won't say all, but most of them, they never even get a chance to use their brains or use their ideas. They are solely relying on the hourly income that they are getting. And that's more lucrative for them than staying back home. Then why won't they go abroad? And we are losing all this incredible youth energy, all this incredible youth ideas to nothing. And how can we expect youth to function properly in this country? And how can we expect them to retain back home and work here? So all I expect from the government is bringing new policies that are actually making difference in my life, instead of having to go through newspaper from 5 days back to know, oh, these are the policies that are happening, but that has not really affected my life in any ways. I need to see visible impact in my life. I need to see the changes happening, and that needs to happen very quickly.
Thank you for that honest answer. I think what you're pointing to that needs to be addressed is, we keep talking about youth. We hear this phrase used a lot, and we see it as a singular entity. But I think what you're pointing out is that there are many divisions, there's privileges among this group. And I think the people on this panel today can also speak to this point, that there is lack of opportunities for a majority of youth in Nepal that many of us have received, but many other youth have not. So with regards to this gap, especially between urban youth and rural youth, what can we do to address this gap? And Lex, I'm going to ask you to answer this question, because I know your work factors into this. What more can we do to address this gap? You can pull from your experiences with Tracing Nepal as well.
So moving on to what Shrinkhala added there in terms of a lot of people that keep going away, and the earlier part of the event had ambitious figures stated regarding the amount of jobs that needs to be created. With what we do in Tracing Nepal, we really want to encourage, I don't force people to come back to Nepal. I say, if you're going to go back to Nepal and take a job, then that's taking one job away from somebody who is more than capable of doing something there. So if you want to think about doing something for Nepal or having a direct involvement in this country, come and be a creator. Okay, be a creator, or from wherever you are. You don't have to come to this country to do something for this country. But whenever we come and bring young people to Nepal, we make sure that we collaborate with small charities led and started by Nepali people, because it's important that Nepali people see Nepali people, and we can be inspired by these figures, homegrown talents as well. And in terms of bridging the gap between urban and rural, I think that's going to be very, very challenging. And I don't have an answer for that, But what I do know is by exposing all these people of different social classes or educational backgrounds, it's a start to realizing how much we have in terms of our potential, and also seeing that, you know what, sometimes we think that moving forward and progress means looking looking towards the West. But now that is changing. That is changing. There's the center point. I don't believe it's the West anymore, right? So I think we just need to emphasize on that. And there's a lot of energy there. For me, when I think about New Nepal, I don't remember the policies. I think about social media. Because for me, social media has exposed me to the New Nepal and the energy that Nepali youth have brought.
And with just furthering that discussion, with Tracing Nepal, the experiences are very much packaged as, come back and volunteer, but also engage in domestic tourism, engage with Nepal's beautiful resources, natural resources. How do you make sure that people's intentions, when they come back to Nepal, are responsible? You talked about romanticizing coming home. How do you filter that intentions, and how do you ensure that these projects are sustained, so even after the trip, that these conversations are still happening?
Right. So I believe that tourism can act as a tool for development, but with Tracing Nepal, what I want to emphasize is that tourism and Tracing Nepal can be a catalyst for sustainable development. Voluntourism has its ills, and having been exposed and been part of various things, I want to make sure that how can I make it better? How can I make it ethical as well? The other thing is, this year I believe we had most number of entrants of Nepalese men from Nepal to join the British Gurkhas. So that's between 300 to 350 Nepali people joining the British Gurkhas every year. Now just imagine, majority of them will go on to live in the UK, that will be their home, and there's going to be families. So the Nepali diaspora in the UK is going to grow massively in the upcoming 5, 10, 15 years. Not that it hasn't already. So it makes me question, what am I going to do now? How can I make Tracing Nepal bigger? So individuals like me who are slightly back and forth, I can catch in on them, right? And at the moment, it's a 2-week experience. And what I don't want is someone coming for 2 weeks and thinking, I'm going to change Nepal, because face it, you're not. People have lived here all their life, and change is something which is continuous. But it's important that I need to bring ideas, and maybe from the government side, things like the American Peace Corps, okay? A revamped 2019-2020 version of that, flouted to the Nepali youngsters of the diaspora to come back. Teach for Nepal is such an amazing example. So something like that, where now we have that connection and that bridge. It's about building bridges, and as youths alone, we can't work by ourselves. So it's really important that this communication is always intact. And for some of us, we have to be very hungry. We have to push, we have to be persistent, and that needs to pull through.
100%, I definitely agree with that. And I feel like Sumnima, as a living example of this, as someone who was in the diaspora and made that decision to come, you mentioned that you left when you were 6 months old, and now you're back. What does that process look like? What kind of decisions did you make? What led you to come back?
There was no one sort of moment, really. It's a difficult decision that everyone goes through. So many questions that we all have. What am I going to do when I go back? How am I going to earn enough money? So in my case, it was really, again, when I came to cover the earthquake and I saw how the youth mobilized, and both inside the country and outside, how they were using all their contacts, trying whatever it was to get supplies across the border, fundraising, all of that. And it was very inspiring. And the fact that so many temples had been destroyed particularly affected me. And I knew then that I wanted to come back and do something here. Fortunately, I had enough savings that I could come here, and I had my family's support as well, so I didn't have to worry about not making any money for the next 2-3 years. And but a lot of people don't have those options, and that's fine. I don't think we have to, people always say, oh, Nepalis aren't coming back, but I think they have very valid reasons for not being able to come back, and what have we really done to provide better opportunities for them anyway? But for those who do want to come back, and as Lex was saying, I would say, everyone has this idea that they're going to come here and change Nepal. And, Nepal is what it is. It's not going to change overnight. It is what it is. But what you can do is you can find your niche, and you can really focus on that. You can really work on that, and eventually change will come.
Thank you. And because you're mentioning your reporting during the time of the earthquake, I remember following your reports very closely. And in one of them, you describe youth using whatever they could find, like plates, to dig people from the rubble. And all this energy was really described at the time as a movement, a youth movement. So I'm wondering, just reflecting on those experiences, do you see that sense of solidarity among Nepali youth today? And what can be better done to harness this energy at times when there isn't a disaster, when there isn't an immediate need? What can be done to harness this energy again?
Well, disasters oftentimes bring the best in people. But again, the reaction I saw here was quite unusual. I've covered other disasters. It was phenomenal. And I don't know if we had seen that kind of solidarity lately, but it's certainly something we can harness. And online I see it. For instance, whether it's CNN Heroes, or whether it's when Shrinkhala was off in China for Miss World, and the way the country came together, everyone was talking about, everyone was rooting for her, and it's almost like we're so patriotic, it's so ingrained actually, that it's not so difficult to harness that. We just have to find the right causes, I think. And right now, I would say pollution could be one of them, or climate change, many other issues. But it's there, we just have to, it's ingrained, but we just have to sort of harness that a little bit.
Yeah, and I think reflecting on Nepal's larger history, youth have time and time again taken to the streets for important political transitions. But now that we've entered this, as the Prime Minister said, period of stability, what will be our challenge as this generation of youth? How will what will be our challenge? How will we maintain our momentum? How will we use our energy? What kind of issues will we be tackling now that there is more stability? Anyone, open to the panel.
I'd like to take that up. When I talked about the kind of signals that we saw in our society of progress, that the arts and the artisans, the hip-hop and the influencers, if Kantipur was published today after its very first publication in 2049, say it's not a daily, it's published once in 25 years, what would the headlines read? It would read about the progress that we've had, isn't it? It would read about the way we're carrying mobile phones, the way child mortality has decreased, the way we've progressed as democracy and all. Because progress takes a long, long time. But negative news happen every day. While we have a lot of youth who are hopeful about the future, they live with hope and optimism, there's also a significant number of youth who live with the nostalgia of the past. And I think it's very important, people like you, people like us, people in the media, to share to the world, to share our youngsters the progress that we've made. I was born in Doti. And me, like both my siblings, were not even attended by medical professionals when I was born. So the chances of me surviving my 5th birthday was only 22%. Look at the numbers and the statistics that have gone down today. It's a huge sign of progress, isn't it? We have this inherent negativity bias that as human beings, as youngsters, as everyone, we like to see a cockroach in a ball of cherries, but we never notice a cherry in a ball of cockroaches. Right? So I think we should operate our lives. We do have challenges. We do have problems. We do have issues around the future of the country, around our own futures, right? but it's about sharing the signs of progress that we've made. Because statistically, even today, a woman suffering from breast cancer today has more likelihood of survival than a pregnant woman in the 70s. Right? The poorest of the poorest person today can own a mobile phone, which the richest person in the 70s could not own. So we have had these signs of progress. And I think to change this perspective, we should share stories about progress. We should share stories about changes that we've made. We should not only show the stories of the challenges, but about those small things as society that we've been able to do. What Lex has been doing is a great story that we need to share. What Shrinkhala has been able to do in the world stage, that's a story that we need to share. What Sumnima has been doing and what a lot of youngsters are doing right now are the stories that are worth sharing. And these stories are the ones that need to be shown in the headlines of our papers, in the main news of our media, in our social media. And that is the sign of progress. And that is the world that we should build for everyone. And that's my belief. And that's the optimism that I live by.
100%. I think your point about the role of social media in sharing these stories is also important because social media allows people to craft their own narratives. And Lex, you've very much been doing that. But at the same time, I think it's also important to, I hope I'm not pointing a cockroach in this basket of cherries, but recognize that the government is taking legislative steps to curb free expression online, to kind of limit our capacity to tell stories in certain ways. So with that note, Lex, because this is an important forum for you, what kind of dangers do you think limiting free expression online will pose, and what kind of challenges will youth have to overcome if these limits continue?
For a lot of people, and especially people who belong in the marginalized community, I think I believe and I know that social media is one of the most safe spaces where they can share ideas, they can discover who they are, and they can find other people who are in similar situations. So with what has been coming out in the news recently, and any kind of changes to social media laws, we risk isolating people once again. Okay, I think more groundwork can be done to go about this in a safe and positive way, which encourages good social media practice. And I'd just like to pick up on, there's been lots of movements, whether it was from way back in 2007-8, Nepal Unites, Occupy Balwatar, Rage Against Rape, Justice for Nirmala. So a lot of these things have also been able to get traction because it started from social media, it started from Twitter, and then it went on to other online media platforms and the national daily newspapers. Okay, and if we try to say, this shouldn't be coming on the news, etc., then I'm worried. I'm worried for a lot of other people, how that might make them feel and what that would do to them offline.
And I think because you're pointing to other social media movements in our past, I'm wondering, when we talk about issues of #MeTooNepal, when we talk about bringing justice to Nirmala Pant, how do we ensure that these movements, whether they're born on social media or they're born on the streets, how do we make sure that they remain, they remain with their momentum, they're not lost and fizzled away like some of these past social media movements? How do we ensure that they remain, relevant and not forgotten? What do we do?
So I won't talk too much about it because I believe that there are more key people who are actively in the front lines bringing these stories forth. When it's like midnight in the UK and then I get the first headlines from Nepal, that's when I see, whoa, we're breaking news every morning. I think it's important that there's a degree of responsibility for social media influencers like myself as well to amplify all the things that are taking place. This moment right now, Nepali people, or the youth, global youth, we have a lot of pressure to be aware, to be switched on, to be very rooted in terms of our culture and where we're from, but as well to present ourselves as a global citizen, right? And it's really important that we are aware and we understand all the things that are happening as well, so we can be better humans as well.
And because we're talking about the potentials of social media, Shrinkhala, I'm going to ask you to chime in here as well, because you've been very vocal about social media's double-edged nature and how the internet isn't a safe space for every youth. So could you talk a little bit about the challenges that social media presents for youth?
So when Sixit said that we need to glorify all the good things that's been happening in Nepal, I've been actually a victim of popular, I don't know the term, but I was all over social media to a point that I hated turning on YouTube. I hated turning on Facebook because most of it was fake news, and I was over-glorified at a lot of points. So what I'm trying to say is that media today is progressing in such a way that it's picking the news that it wants to offer to the people. A lot of new things are happening in our country. A lot of good things are happening in our country, but that's not been portrayed by social media. You can look into the trending pages in YouTube, and you'd be sad to see what's trending in Nepal. And what I'm trying to say is that media has a big role to play, a very, very big role to play. But what's happening right now is media is picking the story that it wants to offer for clickbaits, and social media is, agree or not, but one of the biggest platform for spreading news all around the country, and 90% of it is not reliable. We are not educated, or we are not as aware to figure out what's fake news and what's real news. We are not as aware to know what's right and what's wrong. So I'd like to share an experience. So one morning I just woke up and I got a call from one of the very reputed online news agencies, and they asked me, Shrinkhala ji, is it true that what's been circulating around social media, is it true? And I was totally unaware because I had quite gone down with the hype, and I was living a low life, in my own sense. But suddenly the news agency called and said, there is a news about you selling your kiss when you were 12 years old to a man for a red rose. Is it true? And I laughed at the concept because so yeah, I'd like to share it in Nepali actually. Shrinkhala ji, के यो सत्य हो, तपाईले 12 वर्षको उमेरमा रातो गुलाफको लागि चुम्बन बेच्नु भयो रे. And I laughed so hard because it was actually a poem that I had written for awareness related to sexual harassment. It was clearly just a poem, and they made a news out of it saying I was actually a victim of that, and it was my first person narrative instead of saying that it was actually a poem that I had written. And then I go through the news, and at the end it was written, P.S. We are still yet to confirm if the news is true. We tried to contact Shrinkhala on the phone, but she did not pick up, so we are yet to confirm. But the post had thousands of shares, and I could see in the comments a lot of negativity coming, in a sense that, oh, what more can we expect from a winner of a beauty pageant? Oh, she's showing her true colors, this and that. So we need a very, very strict cyber law. We need apps that could control fake news from real news. I could see a lot of new ideas and apps coming in that could help us do that, and a lot needs to be done with policies. Again, I'm focusing on that because, again, cyber laws, this and that, everything needs to be updated as soon as possible.
So I guess, like, what do we do about this, having to maintain this balance? How do we make sure that the internet is a free and open space, but at the same time a safe space? Does it start with legislation? Does it start with media literacy? Where's the best place to start, do you think? How do we maintain this balance?
Definitely media literacy should be there, because when I was young, I remember having to read about mouse and keyboard and how mouse is used to navigate around this and that, but the youth today do not need to learn that. I mean, the children today, they don't need to learn about what a keyboard is or what a CPU is. So what we could start with is actually educating the children in the schools about social media, what are the right ways to use it, what are the wrong ways to use it, and not just children, but everyone around needs to get this big awareness campaign about what's right and what's wrong, what kind of pictures you should be posting, how could you protect your children from the negative influence of social media. There's a lot that needs to be done, but we could start with having textbooks that could teach them about social media, about what's right and wrong, having big campaigns all around social media, again, sponsored campaigns about how to use social media properly, and awareness about social media. It's very much necessary, yes.
Can I just add something? I'd just like to say that, it is what is something so free and available to, it is very difficult to control that, okay? But I do understand that with where we are and how much internet penetration has taken place in this country, this is bound to happen. This is bound to happen, but now we must think about what can we do to make it easier? What can we do to bring that kind of, as you said, social media literacy in? There are people who have gone from having nothing to directly a smartphone. So we're missing that computer kind of generation. Whereas some of us, we had a computer, we had a laptop, but now people just have a smartphone. So that's why, and I think there's that sense of whole excitement, and hopefully in the next few years, the online media and a lot of the websites will start filtering out as well. And and people need to be able to, a lot of our own people who are very influential from Nepali entertainment industry, I feel like it's very important that these people share the right links. These people are much more inquisitive and curious about the content that they are putting out, that they are liking. Because when they share it and about 150,000, 250,000 of their followers start reading it, that just exacerbates this problem even more.
100%. And I just wanted to ask now, since we're on this topic as well, I'll ask 2 more questions. What role did social media play in shaping relationships between Nepalis here, there, and everywhere in the diaspora? And like, how important is it in maintaining this relationship and opening up new opportunities for these kind of engagements between Nepalis across the world and here?
Before 10 years back, social media, Facebook, high five, that was the only way, all right? There used to be blogs, there used to be very few blogs, but mainly in the Nepali language. But over the course of that, there's been a wealth of resources as well, and that's how we get to know one another's work. And for me, maybe as a normal common person, maybe we have a lot of good things that come out of social media, but I do understand Shrinkhala's point. As a public figure, you can be at the face of how this terribly goes wrong as well, but I'm all for social media, and I definitely think that we can do more, and because this world is going digital. This world is going digital, and this is not the time to limit it.
100%. And I think on that note of going digital, we're going to open up for Q&A, but we ask that you submit your questions through the app. So if you have downloaded the Kantipur Conclave app, simply go to this key session, Youth for Nepal, on day 1, and submit your questions with this bar underneath that says Ask Questions, and I'll read them above. Yeah, and while we're waiting for questions, can I ask one more? This is for all panelists. Of the 4.18 billion billion budget allocated for the Ministry of Youth and Sports this year, almost half has been earmarked for the sports sector. If you were at the helm of affairs, where would you invest this money and why?
So that's interesting. That's quite a big figure as well. You know, sports is incredible, but sports also can isolate a lot of people as well. So what I would think is we can, don't stop, but we can train people to be more respectful and to make sports more inclusive as well. The other thing is, I believe, in sports, it's all about training to be a strong person, but sports alone will not shape the youth to be the person that we expect them to be. We need science as well, because that teaches us how to be logical. We need arts, because art teaches us to be a better human as well. So I think now we need to start, as I said, draw a bridge from sports as well. How can we make this cool? How can we make this accessible for a lot of people who might feel excluded from sports itself?
All right, I'm going to pull from one of these questions. So Samir Rana asks, what is your personal understanding of leadership, and what role do you think this can or will play moving forward in terms of young leaders contributing to this Unleashing Nepal's Potential movement? There wasn't a specific addressee, so anyone is welcome to answer.
In terms of leadership, I think as young leaders in Nepal, there are a few things that I feel are very important. We've always associated this country with Mount Everest and the birthplace of Buddha and things like that, which are also true. But I think Nepal is a country of common values. What are the common values that we care about in this diversity? Right. I think there are 2 different leadership roles that we need to play. One is on the local level. The other one is on the global level. On the local level, what are the connecting dots that connects us together? How we celebrate the differences by embracing uniqueness in one another. I think that should be the common point, and the new leadership should be able to do that. On the global level, I think what are the things that we really care about on the global level? And what are the things that we can actually lead? Climate change is one of them, right? We've learned recently by 2100 we're not going to have 2/3 of our, or 1/3 of our snow in our mountain, right? I think these are the things that we need to care about. These are the issues that we need to take forward. And I think being in Nepal, rather than being an ultra-nationalist, there are things that we need to care about. Pollution is killing us. But how often do you see, how many number of people you see with the masks compared to Dhaka Topi in the streets? Not wearing a mask would kill you, or get you sick at least. But not wearing a Dhaka Topi will not do anything, isn't it? So what are the real challenges? What are the real things that we care about? Pollution, climate change. These are the things that we should not only be aiming at taking a local leadership on, but also these are the things that we could catapult us into taking up global leadership, because these are the things that are happening right down our doorsteps, and these are the things that we should care about.
Okay, one more. This is from Pradeep Baudel. He's asking, any thoughts on how we can engage youths who go to Middle East for construction and other menial jobs, and how we can make them more welcome when they arrive at Kathmandu airport? This is for anyone.
So the question was, how can we make the youth go to Middle East?
No, how can we make youths who are returning from more menial jobs in the Middle East, how can we make them more welcome when they arrive at Kathmandu airport?
Well, that's a strong question. Nepal needs a lot of skilled manpower, skilled labor, in a sense that if you are building a house, if you see, you would choose a laborer from India over someone from Nepal, because you know that they are better at doing the job, they are more efficient, and they will deliver you the job on time, instead of a Nepali worker who will just try to fit into the 10 to 5 frame, and he will try to postpone fitting the tiles as much as possible, because he will earn more if he works for 7 days instead of 5. What I'm trying to say is, whenever Nepali youth, they go abroad, they sink into the mindset of working hard, of being efficient, of doing things on time, because they are answerable to someone on top. But whenever they come back to Nepal, we shift into this comfort zone where, oh, Nepal to bhayihalcha ni. So what we can learn from them is all the hard work that they have put into the work in the other country, that's still possible in Nepal, and we need to create an environment like a strong agency maybe that could welcome them back home, and maybe they could train more people in Nepal for more skilled jobs, for more skilled manpower, for more skilled laborers, because we have a big shortage of it, and all the money is going to the neighboring country instead of people in Nepal. I think we could help them train other people and help them get into the mindset that, in Nepal also you can work efficiently and productively. Just a simple thought.
Thank you. I think you've given us plenty to talk about today and frame our mindset as we continue our conversations throughout the event. So thank you so much. I think this was a great way to start the event, to think about future, to think about how youth can be involved in this larger movement. So I'll definitely be carrying over some of my notes in further discussions at this event, and I invite the audience to do the same.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our wonderful panelists and our moderators. So maybe a big round of applause for this Youth for Nepal panel.
The Kantipur